It's an exciting year for the Mac, with Apple set to release more new Mac updates this year possibly than ever before, with a new M2 MacBook Pro, new M2 MacBook Air, M2 Mac Mini, M2 iMac, and of course a new M1 Pro Mac Mini, iMac Pro, and Apple's most powerful desktop computer with a super advanced version of the M1 Max chip to show off the sheer brute force power of what Apple Silicon is truly capable of with Apple's most powerful desktop computer, the Mac Pro. And while we've talked a lot about new Macs for this year, I really wanted to make a video with everything we know about the updated Apple Silicon timeframe for 2022, because some Macs may be coming sooner than initially expected, while other Macs are likely to face delay. So if you want to keep up to date on all of this Mac news, well, get subscribed, and if you're a returning viewer, leave a comment below on what Mac you're the most excited for this year, and be sure to hit the like button as well so we can conquer the YouTube algorithm together. Okay, so let's start in chronological order here, because we may be just a few weeks away from seeing our first new Mac of the year at Apple's rumored March event, and I think that this Mac will be a new version of the Mac Mini. Now, the Mac Mini update that I think is the most likely is just a Pro version of the Mac Mini, or one that would replace the current Space Gray Intel version in the lineup. This Mac Mini could get a new design with a flatter profile and plexiglass top with a wider selection of ports compared to the M1 Mac Mini, but I think the most important thing about this update, and the easiest thing to predict here, is what chips Apple will be putting into this device, and that of course would be the new M1 Pro and M1 Max chip. And that will just be a huge update coming from the Intel Mac Mini. It's going to get way faster on almost every metric here. Well, yeah, not almost every metric. It's going to be faster in single-core CPU power, faster in multi-core CPU power, and it's going to get a huge, massive leap in GPU performance. And it should be spec'd with everything the M1 Pro and M1 Max chips offer on the MacBook Pro. So it should be able to be configurable up to 64 gigabytes of unified memory and up to 8 terabytes of storage. The Mac Mini Pro, as I call it, may sound like a boring desktop computer, but I actually think it might represent one of the best valued Macs of this entire year and change the entire preconceived notions of what a Mac Pro desktop looks like, as this thing will basically be a mini Mac Pro. Now, this may not be the only Mac announced at this event. If you are to believe last-minute leaks that a new M2 MacBook Pro could be announced at this event. This M2 MacBook Pro, according to the leaks, would look exactly the same as the current 13-inch M1 MacBook Pro, and even still feature things like just 2 USB-C ports, and still have the touch bar in the keyboard, which the new MacBook Pros just got rid of. So if that's true, the only real change here could just be the chip itself, which would be a new M2 chip, which would technically be the first true next generation of Apple Silicon. The M2 chip itself would get a power boost and feature the fastest single-core performance out of any Mac out there, and that's even above the M1 Max chip, and probably even above something like a future Mac Pro's performance in single-core performance. Mind you, all of those other computers will still be kings in multi-core performance. But the M2 still will make gains in multi-core performance as well, and even some GPU performance, all with that amazing energy efficiency design that we come to expect with the M1 chip, with amazingly cool thermals and even more impressive battery life. So the M2 chip will add a nice value boost for the MacBook Pro for sure, but it could end up being disappointing if it really is the same design, especially after seeing just how good the new MacBook Pro design is, and if it really keeps the touch bar, it just kind of sounds out of place in the lineup. Now, the strange thing is, if Apple is going to release a new M2 chip and put it into this new MacBook Pro and really release that in March, well, there's nothing really stopping them from releasing any of the other Macs at any time with just the addition of an M2 chip. So perhaps we could expect a new M2 Mac Mini, or a new M2 iMac refresh at this event too, as Apple could change nothing with their designs and simply replace the M1 chip that's already inside of these machines with an M2 chip, making it a very simple spec bump and a very easy to release product, so really it could come at any time. So if the M2 MacBook Pro is at this event, I would actually expect all of those M2 Macs, with the exception of the MacBook Air, to be announced at that event or within the coming months after this event. As to why the M2 MacBook Air won't be at this event, well, you'll have to keep watching to find out. Okay, as we move into the year, the next Mac update we can expect is actually not that much further down from March. And that will be an update at Apple's Worldwide Developer Conference, also known as WWDC. Now, WWDC 2022 is when we will get the first versions of Apple's new software offerings like iOS 16, macOS 13, watchOS 9, and more. But it's also an event where sometimes hardware can make an appearance, like in 2013 when we got the Mac Pro, and in 2017 when we got the iMac Pro. And I think this year, there's a good chance we can see some Mac hardware emerge. The first Mac I would expect at this event is the Mac Pro. This would be Apple's full-size desktop tower running Apple Silicon, although this time it could be getting a size reduction thanks to the power efficiency of the M1 chips, with Apple rumored to introduce a half-size Mac Pro. It may even borrow some design inspiration from one of Apple's coolest looking desktop computers, the G4 Cube. Now, the most we know about this desktop at this point is actually the processor, which would feature a souped up version of the M1 Max chip, with a current report from Mark Gurman saying that this Mac Pro on the low end could have a 20-core CPU design and a 64-core GPU design, and on the highest end, a 40-core CPU design and a 128 massive GPU core design. And the way that Apple would do this is by actually using a dual version of the M1 Max chip and then a quad version of the M1 Max chip. This means that it's possible that the dual version of this chip would also be able to be spec'd up with up to 128 gigabytes of unified memory, and then the quad version would max out at 256 gigabytes of unified memory. I would also assume that, like how the M1 Pro and M1 Max chip have different bin versions with lower CPU and GPU core counts, I assume this Mac Pro would also have just as many different options for CPU and GPU core count, so prices for this machine should still be around the $5,000 to $6,000 price point. The most unknown thing about this Mac Pro is, will it be upgradable at all? The M1 architecture is so integrated at this point, and that's one of the reasons why it's just so fast, with all of those shared pipelines. So it's probably unlikely, at least to me, that Apple will allow any sort of configurability, at least with off-the-shelf parts. So I wouldn't expect to be able to go into the store and just buy whatever third-party RAM you want it to and then add it to this machine, and probably the same for even things like storage. It might be hard even adding something as simple as that. But maybe Apple could introduce a special module or connection to add more memory or storage if you need it to upgrade. Now, another Mac at this event should be the bigger 27-inch iMac or iMac Pro, and this iMac Pro will probably feature the same M1 Pro and M1 Max chips as the current MacBook Pro, but it might also possibly feature a weaker version of that M1 Max Duo chip that the Mac Pro is supposed to receive, because this is a pro-level desktop. It should have more power than the MacBook Pros have. So I am expecting it to gain some power there, and not necessarily even in the CPU area, because I think the CPU performance is fine, but I do think that iMac Pro should come with a stronger GPU. And because it's a pro-level desktop, it should probably also come with more ports in the M1 iMac. It should also be thicker to incorporate better thermal design to cool the more power-hungry chips. But best of all, I think, is it's actually rumored to come with a mini LED display, which would let this Mac get the same amount of display brightness as a Pro Display XDR with up to 1600 nits of peak brightness. And like the MacBook Pro, it could also feature a ProMotion display with a 120 Hz maximum refresh rate, and pack that in with a 5K display, and I think you're going to get one of the best looking displays and one of the smoothest looking displays on the market as a combo. I know there's faster refresh rate displays in the PC monitor space, but as a combo, the HDR, the 5K, the 120 Hz sounds like an amazing display. Okay, now what about after WWDC? Well, here's where things can get interesting. So this could be one of the most interesting Macs to come in 2022, but we'll probably have to wait to the end of the year to actually get our first glimpses on the new redesigned MacBook Air. And it's supposed to be a major new redesign for this year. So it's supposed to be even thinner and lighter than the current design and a design with less volume overall. As Apple kind of plans to bring the bezel strategy from the 14-inch MacBook Pro, but keeping the same 13-inch display size that the current MacBook Air has to make this laptop more portable rather than focusing on having a bigger screen. The Air is also set to receive the new MagSafe charging port, USB-C on both sides, and could come in a wide array of colors just like the redesigned iMac. Like the M2 Macs we mentioned before, it will also come with that same M2 chip, giving the Air even more power. However, unlike those other M2 Macs, this Air should be receiving a redesign and upgraded components as well, with the same mini LED display as the MacBook Pro, giving the Air a huge jump up in display quality with 1600 nits of peak brightness and a 1,000,000:1 contrast ratio. With these great additions, though, may come a price increase, with most rumors stating that Apple plans to keep the M1 MacBook Air in the lineup as a more affordable laptop option, and Apple offering this redesigned M2 MacBook Air as a more premium offering, with most guesses estimating that the starting price for this laptop will be at least $1,200. As for when we can see this MacBook Air, well, I think it's actually probably to come out sometime in the fall, probably around October. And if the M2 Macs I mentioned at the start of this video are not at this rumored Apple March 8th event, well, I think they would probably be announced around the same time as an M2 MacBook Air. So if you don't see those other M2 Macs at Apple's March event, well, just a little asterisk here. They'll probably come out around this time. And that is based on my original estimates. So yeah, that is the updated Apple Silicon 2022 timeframe. It's going to be an incredibly busy year for the Mac, and looking at this lineup, I'm kind of getting really excited to finally start testing some of these computers, and I know you're probably getting a little bit antsy because you actually want to see them. So if you're just as excited as me, make sure you're subscribed to the channel for more. Hopefully coverage starts soon. And as always, really appreciate you watching. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video. Take care, everyone.